The air in Cinder Hollow, Tennessee, on the morning of October 31st, 1822, was colder than it had any right to be. It was a frigid, predatory cold that clung to the hollows between the ancient, sleeping hills of the Appalachians. It was this cold that first troubled Silas Croft, a traveling peddler whose route took him through the isolated valley only twice a year. The second thing that troubled him was the silence. Havenwood, the small settlement nestled in the heart of the hollow, was always quiet, but this was a profound, unholy stillness. There was no smoke rising from the chimneys, no dogs barking a warning at his approach, no sound of axon wood echoing from the forest. There was only the whisper of the wind through skeletal trees and another, more sinister smell carried upon it. It was the scent of ash, but heavier, richer, and deeply, deeply wrong. As his horse-drawn cart rounded the final bend, the source of the silence and the smell became horrifyingly clear. Where the town's modest chapel, the Church of the Cleansing Flame, had once stood, there was now only a blackened, skeletal ruin. A jagged maw of charred timbers clawed at the gray, unforgiving sky. Smoke, thick and oily, still coiled from the smoldering foundation like a dying breath. It was a scene of utter devastation, a macabre tombstone marking the very center of the community. But it was not the destruction that caused Silas's blood to run cold. It was the absolute absence of life. No one was fighting the embers. No one was weeping amidst the wreckage. No one was even there to witness the desecration. The entire congregation, the entire settlement of Havenwood had vanished, or so it seemed. The horrifying truth, buried beneath the ash and timber, was far more disturbing. They hadn't vanished at all. They were still inside. Silas Croft, a man hardened by the frontier, felt a primal fear he had not known since his days fighting in the Creek War. He dismounted, his boots crunching on ground that was unnaturally brittle. The heat radiating from the church's foundation was still intense, a malevolent warmth against the morning's chill. He called out, his voice sounding small and foolish against the oppressive silence. "Hello, is anyone there?" The only answer was the groan of a settling beam within the ruin. He took a few steps closer, his hand covering his nose and mouth against the putrid air. He could now see details that made his stomach churn. The church's single heavy oak door, or what was left of it, was not broken outwards as it would be if people tried to flee. Instead, a massive, scorched iron bar lay across its inner frame. It had been bolted from the inside. This was not a tragic accident. This was a cage, a self-made tomb. The horrifying implications began to crawl up his spine, cold and sharp. What kind of fire traps people inside a house of God? What kind of congregation bars the only exit? As the sun struggled to pierce the Tennessee gloom, its weak light illuminated the horrifying centerpiece of the macabre scene. The church bell, a source of comfort and community for the people of Havenwood, had melted in the inferno. It had dripped from its steeple like wax, pooling on the stone steps below in a grotesque, misshapen lump of bronze, a permanent, silent scream. This was the first official discovery in a cold case that would become one of America's most forbidden and disturbing mysteries. A mystery that authorities would try to erase. A story that locals would only whisper behind locked doors. A horrifying tale of faith twisted into a curse that consumed an entire town. To understand the horrifying events in Cinder Hollow, one must first understand the world of 1822. This was frontier America, a time and place balanced on a knife's edge between fervent hope and profound, ever-present dread. In the isolated valleys of eastern Tennessee, life was a brutal, unforgiving cycle. Settlers battled unforgiving winters, failed crops, and diseases that could wipe out a family in a matter of weeks. The wilderness itself felt sentient, a vast, dark ocean of trees that pressed in on all sides, full of shadows and unseen dangers. For the people of Havenwood, survival was a daily prayer, and faith was not a comfort, it was a shield. The community was founded on a bedrock of unyielding, puritanical piety. They were a people who saw the hand of God or the devil in every fortunate harvest and every sick child. Their world was one of signs and omens, of stark good versus absolute evil. There was no room for gray. This profound isolation bred a unique kind of psychology, Cut off from the developing nation, news from the outside world was sparse and often months old. Their only authority was the scripture, and their only leader was the man who interpreted it. This created a fertile ground for influence, for a charismatic voice to take root in the soil of their fear and desperation. They were a people searching for a shepherd, for someone to give meaning to their suffering and promise them a reward for their hardship. They yearned for a salvation that felt as real and as potent as the hardships they endured every single day. And in the spring of 1821, they believed they had found him, a man who would lead them not to salvation, but into a nightmare from which there would be no escape. His name was Reverend Alistair Blackwood. He arrived in Havenwood not as a man of the cloth assigned by some distant church authority, but as an itinerant preacher, a wanderer who claimed to carry a purer, more direct word of God. His appearance was as striking as his sermons. He was tall and gaunt, with a face that seemed carved from old wood, dominated by eyes that burned with a feverish intensity. When he spoke, his voice was a mesmerizing instrument, capable of dropping to a conspiratorial whisper or rising to a thunderous crescendo that seemed to shake the very rafters of the small, hastily built church. His past was a mystery he deliberately cultivated. He spoke of having ministered in the decadent cities of the East, of witnessing sin so profound it had shaken his soul. He claimed to have been called by visions to seek out the truly pious, the last remnants of God's chosen flock, hidden away in the wilderness. To the people of Havenwood who felt forgotten by the world, this was a powerful, intoxicating message. They were not forgotten, they were chosen. Blackwood's initial sermons were orthodox, yet delivered with a passion that was almost hypnotic. He spoke of hope, of redemption, of a heavenly paradise that awaited the faithful. He walked among the families, learned their names, comforted their sick, and mourned their dead. He quickly became the unshakable pillar of the community, his word treated as gospel. He was more than a preacher, he was a prophet. He was the answer to their prayers. But beneath the surface of his righteous charisma, a different, more macabre ideology was beginning to take shape. An insidious philosophy that viewed life not as a gift to be cherished, but as a stain to be scoured away. The first year under Reverend Blackwood's guidance was, by all accounts, a period of renewed purpose for Havenwood. The community became more unified, more industrious. They built a new, larger church, felling the ancient oaks of Cinder Hollow with a religious fervor. They named it the Church of the Cleansing Flame, a title Blackwood himself suggested, claiming it came to him in a dream. The name seemed poetic, a symbol of their faith purifying the wild frontier. No one could have known its horrifyingly literal meaning. Blackwood's influence became absolute. He established a communal system where harvests were shared, and the church became the sole distributor of food and supplies. This seemingly charitable act had a darker purpose. It made every single resident completely dependent on him, not just for spiritual guidance, but for their very survival. He began to isolate the community further, preaching that the outside world, even the nearby towns, were dens of iniquity, Sodoms of the mountain that would corrupt their pure society. Travelers were no longer welcomed. They were met with suspicion and turned away at the edge of the valley. Letters from distant relatives went unanswered. Havenwood was slowly, deliberately, being sealed off from the rest of humanity. It was becoming Blackwood's personal kingdom, a social and spiritual laboratory where he could cultivate his increasingly disturbing beliefs without interference or question. The shield of faith was being reforged into the walls of a prison, and the congregation, in their desperate search for a savior, had become willing, unknowing inmates. The stage was being set for a final, terrifying act of devotion. The shift was subtle at first, a slow poisoning of the well. Reverend Blackwood's sermons began to take on a darker, more apocalyptic tone. The language of hope and redemption was gradually replaced by a vocabulary of corruption, filth, and damnation. He preached that the very soil they tilled was tainted by original sin, that their bodies were prisons of flesh, and that the material world was a cage built by Satan to trap their immortal souls. He spoke of a great purification, a necessary trial by fire that the truly faithful must endure to prove their worth to God. These were not the comforting words of a country pastor. They were the terrifying pronouncements of a doomsday prophet. He introduced marathon prayer sessions, forcing his congregation to remain kneeling on the hard, wooden floors of the church for hours, sometimes through the night, confessing their sins aloud. These public confessions became a horrifying spectacle of psychological manipulation. Neighbors were pitted against each other, forced to reveal their innermost doubts and resentments, which Blackwood would then use as evidence of the sickness that pervaded the community. He fostered an atmosphere of intense paranoia, where a sideways glance or a whispered word could be interpreted as a sign of demonic influence. Children were encouraged to report on the sins of their parents. The strong bonds of family and community that had once defined Havenwood began to fray, replaced by a collective anxiety and a singular, fearful devotion to the Reverend. The Church of the Cleansing Flame was no longer a sanctuary. It was becoming a crucible where faith was being tested and burned away, leaving only raw, terrifying obedience. As winter approached in late 1821, Havenwood's self-imposed isolation became absolute. The last dirt track leading into Cinder Hollow was deliberately blockaded with felled trees. The community was now an island, a world unto itself, governed entirely by the increasingly erratic whims of Alistair Blackwood. It was around this time that the symbols began to appear. A local trapper named Elias Thorne, who skirted the edges of the hollow, reported seeing strange, spiral-like patterns painted on the doors of the cabins in what looked like ash or charcoal. He also recounted a disturbing encounter with two men from the settlement, their faces gaunt and their eyes filled with a hollow, zealous light. When he offered to trade furs, they simply stared at him, clutching crude wooden amulets bearing the same spiral symbol, and told him that the currency of the fallen world holds no value for the soon-to-be ascended. Thorne, unnerved, avoided the valley from then on, spreading tales in the nearest town of a damned settlement that had fallen under a dark curse. His warnings were largely dismissed as the superstitious ramblings of a mountain man. Yet his account provides the only known external glimpse into Havenwood during its final, horrifying months. Inside the valley, Blackwood's control was total. He banned all music, all laughter, all forms of celebration, deeming them distractions of the flesh. The only sound permitted was the chanting of his new, grim litanies, prayers that spoke not of forgiveness, but of obliteration. The town was being systematically stripped of its humanity, its people reduced to mere vessels for Blackwood's macabre doctrine. The horrifying mystery of what drove them to their end cannot be solved without understanding this psychological dismantling. They weren't just led to the fire, they were hollowed out, remade, and marched their step by agonizing step. The most chilling account from this period comes from the fragmented diary of a young woman named Elspeth, whose family was one of the few that recognized the encroaching madness. The diary, discovered years later tucked into the wall of a collapsed cabin on the valley's edge, paints a horrifying picture of a community's descent. Elspeth writes of Blackwood introducing a new, secret text which he claimed was a lost book of scripture, a gospel he called the Ashen Gospel. He said he had transcribed it from a series of divine visions. This forbidden text was the core of his new religion. It was a radical, terrifying reinterpretation of Christian theology, one that venerated fire as the ultimate agent of divinity. The Ashen Gospel preached that baptism by water was a flawed, temporary cleansing. True salvation, it claimed, could only be achieved through pyrosanctum, the holy fire. It argued that God's purest form was the all-consuming flame of a star, and that to truly become one with God, the faithful must shed their fleshy prisons in a final, voluntary act of purification. The diary describes secret late-night gatherings where Blackwood would read passages from this horrifying book, his voice filled with ecstatic fervor. "The flame does not destroy," Elspeth quotes him as saying. "It liberates. It unchains the soul from the sin of its vessel." We will not be judged in the afterlife, for we will arrive there already perfected as beings of pure divine light. The people of Havenwood, broken down by fear, paranoia, and relentless indoctrination, began to believe him. They were being taught to see their own deaths not as an end, but as a glorious, necessary transfiguration. The story of the Miller family serves as a grim testament to the impossibility of escape. Jedediah Miller, a pragmatic farmer and one of the town's original settlers, grew deeply suspicious of Blackwood's teachings. He saw the hunger in his children's eyes and the fanatical gleam in his wife's. According to Elspeth's diary, Jedediah forbade his family from attending the nightly sermons and began secretly packing their belongings, planning to flee Cinder Hollow under the cover of a new moon. But in a community where every thought was considered a potential sin to be confessed, secrets were a luxury no one could afford. His own son, a boy of 10, terrified of the damnation Blackwood promised for disbelievers, reported his father's plan to the Reverend. The response was swift and brutal. The next morning, as the Millers prepared to leave, they were met on the path by Blackwood and a dozen men from the congregation. They were not holding weapons. Their faces, cold and resolute, were far more terrifying. Jedediah was dragged to the church and forced to stand before the entire community, where he was branded a traitor and a vessel for Satan. Blackwood performed a horrifying ritual of public exorcism, shaming Jedediah for hours until the man's spirit was completely broken. The family was stripped of their farm and possessions, forced to live on meager handouts from the church, a living warning to any others who might dare to question the Reverend's authority. This incident marked a crucial turning point. It extinguished the last embers of dissent in Havenwood. The choice was no longer between belief and disbelief. It was between absolute submission and utter ruin. The doors of the valley were now locked, not just by fallen trees, but by a wall of terrifying, collective fanaticism. If you find these glimpses into forbidden history compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to unearthing the stories that have been deliberately forgotten, because the descent of the Havenwood congregation is about to enter its most macabre and disturbing phase. As the fall of 1822 began, the rituals described in the Ashen Gospel became a part of daily life. Blackwood declared that to prepare for the Great Purification, the congregation must first practice detachment from the physical world. He ordered them to burn their personal belongings, family heirlooms, letters, children's toys, in a nightly bonfire in front of the church. These were the anchors of the flesh, he preached, tethers to a fallen world that would drag their souls to hell. Elspeth's diary describes the horrifying sight of her neighbors, their faces illuminated by the flames, casting their most treasured memories into the fire with a mixture of sorrow and ecstatic fervor. They were systematically erasing their own pasts, severing every link to their former lives. Next came the practice of mortification, acts of physical penance designed to weaken the body and starve the demon of carnality. Fasting became extreme, with the community subsisting on little more than thin broth and coarse bread. Some of the most devout followers engaged in self-flagellation or would walk barefoot through the snow-covered woods, all under the watchful, approving eye of Reverend Blackwood. The once sturdy, hard-working people of Havenwood became gaunt, spectral figures, their bodies wasting away as their minds were consumed by the promise of fiery ascension. They were being prepared, body and soul, for the final horrifying sacrament. The children of Havenwood were not spared from this creeping madness. They were placed at its very center. Blackwood taught that children, being closer to the innocence of birth, were purer vessels for the divine and were thus more receptive to the truth of the flame. He created a special youth sect called the Ashen Lambs. These children, some as young as 5, were separated from their parents for long periods, living in a communal annex of the church where they were subjected to intense indoctrination. They were taught songs with horrifying lyrics about the beauty of the cleansing flame and the joy of shedding one's skin. Outsiders who heard faint singing on the wind from Cinder Hollow would have no idea of the macabre nature of these hymns. The children's games also took a disturbing turn. Elspeth's diary recounts seeing the Ashen Lambs playing a game they called the Final Sermon. One child would stand on a stump mimicking Blackwood's frantic preaching, while the others would build a small pyre of twigs and place dolls upon it. They would then set it alight, chanting phrases from the Ashen Gospel as the crude figures burned. This was not merely play. It was a form of psychological conditioning, a horrifying rehearsal for the coming apocalypse. By twisting the very nature of childhood innocence, Blackwood ensured that his doctrine would be absolute. He was not just converting the current generation. He was creating a new one, born and bred in the ideology of a horrifying death cult. These children, robbed of a future, were being groomed to lead their own parents into the fire. In the final weeks leading up to that fateful October night, a palpable, feverish energy settled over Havenwood. The community's behavior, already strange, became utterly detached from reality. They began to speak of the coming great purification not with fear, but with a joyous, impatient anticipation, as if preparing for a wedding or a festival. They neglected the harvest, leaving crops to rot in the fields. Why bother with earthly sustenance when a divine feast awaited them in the afterlife? They stopped mending their homes and tending their livestock. The physical world and its demands had become meaningless, a temporary stage for the final act of their spiritual journey. A lone hunter checking high. Traps on the ridge overlooking Cinder Hollow later told a magistrate that he witnessed a truly unsettling scene. He saw the entire congregation, dressed in simple white robes, moving as one from the church to the nearby creek. There, they performed a bizarre ritual, not of baptism, but of cleansing with ash. They smeared a paste made of soot and water over each other's faces and bodies, chanting in a low, monotonous hum. They were symbolically marking themselves, shedding their human identities to become sacrifices for a new, terrifying god. The hunter, a deeply religious man himself, said it was the most unholy thing he had ever seen. He described their movements as slow, deliberate, almost trance-like, as if they were already ghosts. They were a people walking toward their own doom, not with the terror of the condemned, but with the serene, chilling certainty of the righteous. The night of October 30th, 1822, was the eve of All Hallows' Eve, a night already steeped in superstition and folklore. For the people of Havenwood, it was to be their last night on earth. Inside the Church of the Cleansing Flame, Reverend Alistair Blackwood delivered his final, horrifying sermon. We can only piece together what was said from the scorched, half-burned remnants of the Ashen Gospel found in the ruins and the chilling predictions in Elspeth's diary. He stood before his flock, his gaunt frame illuminated by dozens of candles, his eyes burning with a triumphant, manic light. He told them that their period of trial was over. He spoke of visions, of angels made of fire who had visited him, and declared that the following night was the chosen moment for their ascension. He painted a vivid, glorious picture of what awaited them beyond the flames. It would not be a painful death, he promised, but a rapturous release. Fire would feel like a warm, loving embrace, the voice of God calling them home. He told them their sacrifice would serve as a beacon, a great pillar of fire that would be a testament to true faith in a world of darkness. "They will see our light from miles away," he thundered, his voice echoing in the silent, captive church. "They will call it a tragedy. They will call it madness, but we will know the truth. We will be with him, cloaked in glory, while they remain trapped in their prisons of flesh, cowering in the darkness. Tonight we are mortals. Tomorrow we shall be gods." The congregation, their minds and spirits worn down to nothing but pure belief, wept and cheered in ecstatic agreement. The final, irreversible preparations had begun. The details of these final preparations are the most macabre part of the entire affair. Under Blackwood's direction, the congregation spent the day of October 31st transforming their church into a pyre. They ripped up the wooden floorboards, piling them in the center of the nave. They brought in dried brushwood, hay, and every flammable object they could find. They emptied their cabins of furniture, chairs, tables, beds, and added them to the growing mound. It was a communal act of destruction, a final, definitive rejection of the material world. But they did not just gather fuel. They also brought barrels of whale oil and animal fat from their stores, substances that would ensure the fire burned hotter and faster. They systematically soaked the walls, the pews, the altar, and the great pile of debris in the center. The air inside the church must have become thick and suffocating with the smell of oil and dry timber, the scent of death itself. A young boy named Samuel, who had been hiding in the woods after being beaten by his father for a minor infraction, was the only witness to these final hours. He watched from a distance, terrified and confused, as his family and friends worked with a quiet, focused determination. He saw his own mother, her face serene and untroubled, carrying the family's spare blankets into the church. He saw the blacksmith bring his tools not to help, but to reinforce the iron bars on the windows. Every action was deliberate, purposeful, and aimed at a single, horrifying goal: to ensure that once the fire started, there would be absolutely no chance of survival and no possibility of escape. As dusk fell over Cinder Hollow, the bell of the Church of the Cleansing Flame began to toll. It was not the cheerful, rhythmic peal for a standard service, but a slow, solemn, continuous drone. It was a death knell, a final summons. The witness, young Samuel, watched from his hiding place as the people of Havenwood, all 77 of them, emerged from their cabins. They were all dressed in the same simple, white robes he had seen them wear before. They walked in a silent, orderly procession towards the church, their faces calm, their eyes fixed forward. There was no hesitation. There were no tears. It was not a march of victims, but a procession of willing participants. His own family walked past his hiding spot. His father, his mother, his little sister. They didn't look for him. They didn't call his name. It was as if he and the entire outside world had already ceased to exist for them. The last person to enter the church was Reverend Alistair Blackwood. He stood at the doorway for a moment, looking out at the empty, silent town he had created and was now about to destroy. Then he turned and went inside. From his vantage point, Samuel saw 4 designated men close the heavy oak doors. He heard the sound of the massive iron bar, the one later found by Silas Croft, being dropped into its brackets, sealing the tomb from within. The bell stopped tolling. An eerie, profound silence fell over the valley once more. The church stood dark and silent against the twilight sky, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. For what felt like an hour, nothing happened. The valley was plunged into darkness and silence. Young Samuel, shivering from both cold and fear, remained frozen in place, convinced he had just witnessed his entire world entomb itself. And then it began. A soft, orange glow appeared in the church windows, flickering like a single candle. But it grew quickly, brightening, intensifying, spreading from window to window with unnatural speed. Within moments, the entire building was illuminated from within, a giant, terrifying lantern in the heart of the hollow. There was no sound of alarm, no panic. Instead, what drifted out into the cold night air was the most horrifying and inexplicable detail of the entire tragedy. It was the sound of singing. It was not the sound of screaming, of people fighting for their lives, clawing at the barred doors. It was the sound of hymns. A chorus of voices, 77 strong, rising in unified, ecstatic praise as the flames began to consume them. Their voices were not strained with pain or terror, but were clear and powerful, a final, defiant testament to their horrifying belief. They were welcoming their own destruction. They were celebrating their own deaths. For Samuel, this was the sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. The sound of his family, his friends, his entire community, singing joyfully as they burned alive. He watched, paralyzed by horror, as the first licks of flame broke through the roof, reaching up into the night sky like demonic fingers. The macabre hymn from within grew louder, competing with the roar of the inferno before it was finally, mercifully, silenced. The fire that consumed the Church of the Cleansing Flame was an unstoppable, ravenous entity. Fed by the oil-soaked wood and the dry tinder of a long, hot autumn, it became a raging inferno in a matter of minutes. The roof collapsed, sending a shower of embers and sparks into the sky that set fire to the surrounding trees, encircling the horrifying scene in a ring of fire. The heat was so intense it cracked the very stones of the church's foundation. The bell in the steeple glowed cherry red before melting and cascading down the facade, a final, grotesque tear from a dying god. Samuel, the lone survivor and witness, was forced back by the searing heat, the sound of the roaring fire a physical blow against him. He could do nothing but watch the pillar of fire that Blackwood had promised. He stayed there all night, hidden in the woods, a traumatized child watching his world be utterly annihilated. He drifted in and out of a state of shock, the horrifying image of the burning church and the memory of the singing seared permanently into his mind. By dawn, the fire had largely burned itself out, leaving behind the smoldering, skeletal ruin that the peddler, Silas Croft, would discover just a few hours later. Samuel, numb and terrified, finally fled, running blindly through the woods, away from the hollow that had been his home and had become his graveyard. His testimony, when he finally stumbled into a neighboring settlement days later, delirious and malnourished, would be the only first-hand account of the horrifying night Havenwood died. But his story, the ramblings of a traumatized boy, would be viewed with deep suspicion and fear. When Silas Croft's report reached the county seat of Maryville, the reaction was one of disbelief and horror. A small posse led by Sheriff Brody Thorne, a grizzled veteran of frontier justice and the uncle of the trapper who had first reported strange happenings, was dispatched to Cinder Hollow. They arrived 2 days after the fire, to a scene of cold, silent devastation. The horrifying stench of death hung heavy in the air, a smell so potent that several of the younger deputies were forced to retreat. The ruin of the church was a blackened skeleton, the ground around it a carpet of gray ash. Sheriff Thorne, a man not easily shaken, described the scene in his official report as an affront to God and man. His first observation matched Silas's. The main door was barred from the inside. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate, planned event. Donning gloves and handkerchiefs over their faces, Horne and his men began the grim, stomach-turning task of sifting through the wreckage. What they found confirmed their worst fears and then amplified them. They uncovered the charred remains of the congregation, a horrifying tableau of death. The bodies were not found clustered near the doors or windows, as one would expect from people trying to escape. Instead, they were found in their pews, or what was left of them. They were seated, arranged as if they were listening to a final sermon when the end came. Men, women, and children sitting together in family groups, their bodies fused to the melted wood and stone in the final, agonizing moments. It was a scene of such macabre, ordered stillness that it suggested an incomprehensible level of acceptance. They had not fought their fate, they had embraced it. The investigation into the Havenwood tragedy was fraught with difficulty and disturbing discoveries. The sheer intensity of the fire had destroyed most of the evidence, leaving behind a nearly unsolvable cold case. It was impossible to determine a precise cause of death for most of the victims. They had simply been incinerated. The official count was 76 bodies, 76 men, women, and children. But there were 77 members of the congregation. One was missing. In the chancel, where the altar once stood, investigators made a discovery that only deepened the horrifying mystery. They found a small, circular area where the stone floor was not just blackened, but had been vitrified, melted into a crude, glassy substance by a heat far more intense than the rest of the blaze. There were no human remains in this circle, nothing at all. But just outside its edge, they found a single, partially melted silver signet ring, bearing the initials AB. It was the ring of Reverend Alistair Blackwood. His body was gone. Had he been utterly consumed by this localized, intense heat? Had he somehow escaped the inferno he created? Or, as some of the more superstitious locals would later whisper, had he been taken, body and soul, by the demonic force he had channeled? This central mystery, the fate of the charismatic leader who had led his flock to their doom, would become the most enduring and debated aspect of the Havenwood curse. The shepherd had vanished, leaving behind only the horrifying evidence of his slaughtered and willing flock. The other key piece of evidence recovered from the ashes was a small, leather-bound book. It was found beneath a fallen section of the stone altar, miraculously preserved, though its edges were charred and its pages brittle. It was the Ashen Gospel, the forbidden text of Alistair Blackwood's death cult. Though parts of it were illegible, enough remained for investigators and theologians to piece together the horrifying ideology that had gripped Havenwood. The text was a twisted tapestry of Gnostic heresies, apocalyptic scripture, and what seemed to be Blackwood's own feverish, narcissistic delusions. It portrayed the God of the Old Testament not as a benevolent creator, but as a flawed, jealous entity who had trapped human souls in prisons of flesh. The book claimed that Christ's true message had been suppressed, a message not of resurrection of the body, but of its utter annihilation as the only path to true spiritual freedom. Fire, the gospel preached, was the agent of this freedom. It was the original divine language, the only force pure enough to break the chains of the physical world. Reading the surviving passages, Sheriff Thorne and the other officials were looking into the very heart of a meticulously crafted madness. It was a complete, self-contained system of belief that justified mass suicide as the ultimate act of faith. The existence of this book proved that the Havenwood fire was not a spontaneous act of insanity, but the calculated, horrifying climax of a year-long campaign of psychological warfare, waged by one man against his own congregation. The testimony of the lone survivor, young Samuel, should have been the key to unlocking the case. However, his story was so traumatic and so fantastic that it was met with deep skepticism. When he spoke of his family and neighbors singing joyfully as they burned, officials found it difficult to believe. The idea was too monstrous, too contrary to the basic human instinct for survival. Some thought the boy was lying to cover some unknown involvement. Others believed the trauma had simply broken his mind, causing him to invent a narrative to cope with the horrifying reality of losing his entire world in a single night. Samuel was unable to provide a coherent timeline and often broke down into fits of screaming or catatonic silence during questioning. He spoke of Reverend Blackwood not as a man, but as a shadow with burning eyes, who promised his followers they would wear robes of fire and walk among the stars. His account, filtered through the lens of a child's terror, sounded more like a dark fairy tale than a reliable witness statement. In the end, his testimony was officially deemed unreliable and was largely discounted in the final report. Samuel was sent to live with a distant aunt in another state, a boy forever haunted by what he had seen and heard, his truth buried under a mountain of official doubt. The only person who could have truly explained the final, horrifying moments in that church had been silenced by the sheer unbelievability of the event itself. The official investigation, faced with a lack of credible witnesses, a vanished perpetrator, and a crime scene mostly reduced to ash, quickly reached a dead end. The county magistrate, eager to close the book on such a disturbing and inexplicable case, issued a final report that was a masterpiece of deliberate obfuscation. It officially declared the Havenwood fire a mass hysteria event brought on by religious fervor and the hardships of frontier life. It listed the cause of death for all 76 victims as perished in a church fire of accidental origin, a conclusion that completely ignored the evidence of the door being barred from the inside. Reverend Alistair Blackwood was officially listed as missing and presumed deceased. The Ashen Gospel was branded a heretical and dangerous text, and all known copies, the original and the transcripts made by the sheriff, were ordered to be burned. The authorities wanted this story to die. They wanted to erase the memory of Cinder Hollow from the maps and from the public consciousness. It was too dark, too unsettling. It challenged the narrative of manifest destiny and righteous, God-fearing pioneers. The idea that a community of faithful Christians could be manipulated into willingly, joyfully, burning themselves alive was a terrifying thought that the fledgling American society was not prepared to confront. The case was officially closed. The books were sealed. And one of the most horrifying crimes in the nation's history was deliberately and systematically banned from public record, condemned to become nothing more than a whispered, forbidden legend. If you are compelled by the dark, untold stories from our past, take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Our journey into this horrifying cold case is far from over, and the lingering questions only lead to more disturbing possibilities. With the official investigation concluded and suppressed, the legacy of the Havenwood tragedy was left to folklore. Cinder Hollow was abandoned. No one dared to resettle the cursed land. The remaining cabins were left to rot, slowly consumed by the very wilderness the settlers had tried to tame. The charred foundation of the church remained as a grim, silent monument to the dead. Over the decades, the story became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to frightened children. They said the hollow was haunted by the spirits of the damned congregation, that on cold October nights you could still hear their phantoms singing on the wind and see a ghostly orange glow where the church once stood. The figure of Reverend Alastair Blackwood morphed from a man into a demonic entity, a boogeyman who stalked the Appalachian hills. He was the devil who had walked among them, a serpent in their garden of faith. These ghost stories, while terrifying, served a purpose. They were a way for the surrounding communities to process an event that defied rational explanation. By turning the story into a supernatural legend, they could distance themselves from the horrifying and very human reality of what had happened. It was easier to believe in ghosts and demons than to accept the chilling truth that ordinary people, your neighbors, could be led to commit the most extraordinary and macabre acts imaginable. But what truly happened to Reverend Alastair Blackwood? This is the central question that prevents the Havenwood case from ever feeling truly closed. The lack of his body at the scene has spawned countless theories, ranging from the mundane to the deeply disturbing. The most rational explanation is that he was simply incinerated, that the spot where he stood burned so intensely that it consumed him completely, leaving behind only his melted ring. Perhaps he used a powerful accelerant on himself to ensure his own destruction, a final, narcissistic act to make his death as spectacular as he believed his life to be. Another, more cynical theory suggests that Blackwood never intended to die with his flock. In this scenario, he orchestrated the entire massacre as a way to cover his escape. Perhaps he slipped out through a hidden exit in the floorboards just before the fire was lit, leaving his congregation to their horrifying fate while he vanished into the frontier with a new identity. He would have been a wolf in sheep's clothing to the very end, a con man whose final grift was the souls of 76 innocent people. This theory, however, fails to explain the vitrified patch of stone where he supposedly made his last stand. It also doesn't align with the psychology of a true cult leader, whose messianic ego often demands they be present for, and a part of, the grand, apocalyptic climax they have engineered. The truth, it seems, is likely far stranger. The final theory is the most unsettling, and the one that persists in the most hushed corners of Appalachian folklore. It suggests that Blackwood did not die, nor did he escape. It posits that the Great Purification was a success, but only for him. This theory leans into the supernatural, claiming that Blackwood was not merely a manipulative preacher, but a genuine practitioner of some dark, forbidden art. That the Ashen Gospel was not just a tool of manipulation, but a genuine grimoire, a book of ritual magic. In this terrifying version of events, the mass sacrifice of his congregation was not an act of shared salvation, but a massive ritual designed to fuel his own personal apotheosis. The 76 souls burning in unison were the price, the source of power for a horrifying transformation. The intense, localized heat that vitrified the stone was not from a chemical accelerant, but from a blast of supernatural energy, the focal point of the ritual. In this version, Alastair Blackwood was not consumed by the fire. He was changed by it, transcending his mortal form to become something else, something ancient and terrible. This theory explains his missing body and feeds the legend of a dark entity that still haunts the Tennessee hills. It is a horrifying thought that the entire tragedy was nothing more than a means to a demonic end. It leaves us with a chilling, unanswerable question. When the authorities tried to bury the story of Havenwood, Were they simply covering up a local tragedy? Or were they trying to hide the fact that something truly evil had been born in that fire, and that it might still be out there, waiting in the darkness? The silence from Cinder Hollow offers no answers, and that perhaps is the most horrifying part of all.